there. If you are new to the channel, my name is Mark. This is Toast Dragon Fantasy, and welcome to the Writer's Den. No need for me today on screen. The important thing is the story. But before I begin it, just like to say a big thank you to everyone who left a prompt. There were some really good ones, and it was a tough choice to pick. The one I went with in the end, as you can see from the title, was Clouds. And I'm going to be honest, as soon as I saw that prompt, something came into my head which I got quite excited about. So we stuck with that one. And yeah, I guess that's all I need to do to introduce it. So that is all I really need to do at this stage. So without further ado, let's get into the story. Hope you enjoy it. On a solitary hill, on the outskirts of a village called Braith, a little girl and her puppy lay. Her eyes were closed, though she was aware of everything around her. She hummed a familiar tune, one which her father liked to play on the lute, and the fingers of one hand moved and plucked as if the grass were strings. Her other hand gently swept up and down over the soft greenery. A lock of strawberry blonde hair caught in the breeze and leapt onto her face. She blew at it irritably and opened her eyes, wincing with the bright light. The puppy beside her, a collie with mismatched eyes named Colin, yawned lazily. It was a wonderful day, and she was in a wonderful place, her favourite place in the world. Every day, if it was bright and warm and she had completed her chores, she would come to this spot and watch the clouds drift across the sky. Most of the other children in the village liked to tear around the place and cause all kinds of mischief, but she preferred the silence and the stillness. The clouds were particularly thick this day. Not so thick that the sun was obscured and the warmth was drowned, but thick enough to permit her one of her favourite hobbies. "I see a goose!" There it was, clear as crystal, the head and the beak, with a long neck, a plump body, and a fluffy, feathery tail. If she listened carefully enough, she could hear it squawk. She had once been on the hill with her friends, Rosamond and Wraith, after nagging them for months to come and see the majesty of the sky themselves. She had seen all manner of wonders that day. They had looked at her as though she were utterly loopy. "I see a rabbit!" She winced at her mistake, and felt the lump of fur and teeth beside her leap to his feet as he began to growl and yap, searching frantically. No, sorry, Colin, I didn't really, only a sky one. You know, up there, not a real one." Colin was young. His vocabulary consisted of approximately 4 words. He wasn't yet sure what sky one meant. Still, after several moments of sniffing the area and whining, heartbroken that there was, in fact, no rabbit, he padded back over to the girl and rolled onto his side in a sulk. "I'm sorry, Colin. I'll be more careful in the future." Colin flapped his ears. The girl knew that, of course. This meant that all was forgiven. She patted the pup affectionately on the head before turning her eyes back to the sky. "I see a sword." The girl sprang clean into the air, which set Colin off again. This time, however, the barking was short-lived, replaced by a whimper, as both girl and dog clapped eyes on a figure sitting but 10 paces away from them. She was sitting with a cup of something, the cup clasped by bone-white fingers. The rest of her arm was consumed by a black hood and cloak, dark as twilight. Her hood was down, revealing the face of what clearly was a woman, and yet wasn't. Like the dog that cowered beside her, the girl saw that the woman had mismatched eyes, one black and bottomless, the other a shade of pale blue. Her hair had been twisted into a series of complicated knots and braids, and her ears, long and pointed, were bejewelled with an array of studs and trinkets. Her nose bent awkwardly to one side. "Hello, child." The girl's eyes widened. Her voice was high and strained, as though air was forcibly vomited from her lungs. She smiled at the girl's reaction, teeth white and a razor. "Aren't you going to say hello back?" The girl shook her head furiously, her fingers playing with the tassels of her skirt. "Are you going to run?" Of course she was going to run. No doubt about it. A strange woman thing had appeared out of nowhere, complete with tea, which was disgusting. She was going to run and tell her father. She had always been warned not to talk to strange people who weren't from the village. Yes, that's what she would do. Her father would... "I see a cat." The girl, her body halfway turned and ready to flee, froze. She slowly eased her gaze back. The woman had set the cup down and was looking at the sky, a gentle smile on her face. A cat? "A cat? Yes, child." The girl looked to the sky and frowned. She could see no cat. "Ah!" said the woman, chuckling. "This is a special kind of cat. Only certain people are able to see it, you see." The girl pursed her lips as Colin waddled over to the woman. She made a half-hearted attempt to stop him, but stopped and watched as the dog moved to sniff at the woman's fingers. "Good dog." To the girl's utter surprise and considerable jealousy, the puppy began to lick the fingers of the woman. "Where did you come from?" the girl asked. "I was born in this very village," the woman replied, "as you were." "Then how comes I've never seen you around before?" "Like that cat in the sky," she said, lifting her head upwards. "I only make myself known to certain special people." The girl's frown softened. Special people? "Are you a witch?" The woman chuckled again. "I prefer the term freelance spell weaver." The girl cocked her head slightly as the woman swilled her body. The girl could not see what she was sitting on. There had been no log or rock this close to her. "What's your name, child?" "Britta," said the girl. "And what's yours?" The woman paused. "Susan." "Susan?" the girl exclaimed. "That's not a witch's name." "Freelance spellweaver, if you please," muttered Susan. "And what can I say? My mother was a fan of the Rocky Horror Picture Show." Britta cocked her head as Susan rolled up the sleeves of her cloak. "So, Britta, you see pictures in the clouds, yes?" "Yes," said Britta brightly, "all the time." "Then I shall let you in on a little secret," said Susan, lowering her voice. "Come closer." Britta hesitated for a moment, but Colin was practically entranced by the woman's touch, and that was enough to convince her. She tentatively stepped closer as Susan leaned in. "The clouds can tell the future." The girl's eyes widened as they immediately shot to the sky. The rabbit was still there, though it was looking a little worse for wear. Britta inhaled sharply. "Am I going to marry a goose?" Susan cackled, a genuine laugh that was not unpleasant. Colin yapped as Susan rocked slightly. "No, child," she replied. "As I said, I can see the future telling clouds, and maybe you will one day as well." Britta frowned again. "But I don't understand," she said. "How can there be clouds in the sky that you can see that I can't?" "You doubt my words?" Britta's breath caught. Susan was looking directly at her now, mismatched eyes piercing her defences, her mouth crooked. I shall prove it then," said Susan, shrugging, before looking to the sky once again. Britta's gaze immediately followed, but the sky had grown overcast. There were now no distinguishable clouds left at all. The poor rabbit had been swallowed whole, and the goose had flown away. She kept looking from the sky to Susan and back again, lost at what to think. She was just about to speak when Susan suddenly gave a bark of triumph. "A flower!" "A flower?" "A flower," said Susan, "with lily-white petals and a blue stalk. Good fortune arrives with this flower." "There's no such thing as a white flower with blue petals," Britta whined. "But there is such a thing as a freelance spell weaver." Britta opened her mouth before closing it again. Susan had a point. Up until 10 minutes ago, she had thought that witches were simply make-believe, a naughty trick that parents used to keep their children in line. Susan picked up her cup which, miraculously, had refilled itself. "It shall begin to rain soon," said Susan. "I would hurry on home before you get wet." She sipped her tea before recoiling with a yelp. "Far too hot still." Britta stared at Susan, waiting for her to say something else. She gave the sky another sceptical look, desperately seeking something that resembled a flower, but there was nothing to be found. When she dropped her head once again, Susan was gone. That night, Britta and her father were down by the river, walking along the planks of the pier. It didn't exactly resemble a dock, but it was often the most lively place in the village, with a number of visiting merchants setting up various stalls to entice the simple village folk into giving over a few hard-earned coins. Britta, one hand resting snugly in her father's and the other clasping a slimy sugar stick, watched as the various strangers worked their magic. One particular vendor caught her eye. He was a brash and bolshy man with a booming voice that had already drawn quite a crowd. She tugged at her father's hand and indicated to the vendor. Her father eyed the stuffed toys that were hanging up above the man on a wooden beam and chuckled. "One go," he said. Britta nodded enthusiastically, mouth full of sugar stick, and hurried over to the stall, pushing her way to the front. She could hear her father muttering apologetically behind her. The stall had an array of ceramic cups, each upturned. There must have been about 20 in total. She watched as another little girl pointed towards one of the cups. The man paused dramatically, his beefy hand resting on the cup, before he lifted it with a flourish. There was nothing underneath. There was a sympathetic sound from the crowd. "Bad luck, little darling," said the man. "Now, who's next?" Britta stepped forward and placed the coin that her father had given her into the man's rough palm. Then she looked down at the cups. "Find the acorn," barked the man, "and take a prize. It's that simple." Britta gave a firm nod, braids of hair jiggling, and began to scan the cups. They all looked the same, white in colour, smudged with dirt. One or two were chipped with general wear and tear, but otherwise there was nothing about any of them that stood out. They even had the same small image imprinted on them, a series of... Britta gave a small gasp and glanced up at the man, who raised an eyebrow, his arms folded. She looked down again. Each cup had an image of a flower etched onto it. Some were more faded than others. One or two were slightly larger. All were different colours. And one... Yes, there it was, right at the back of the array. A small, insignificant flower with white petals and a blue stalk. Exactly as Susan had described. She immediately pointed to the cup. The man looked down at the cup and raised both eyebrows. His face showed begrudging approval as he lifted it to show the acorn resting beneath it. There was an audible cheer from the crowd that had gathered. She felt her father's gentle hand squeeze her shoulders as she pointed to the prize she desired, a soft, multicoloured bird with long tail feathers that was utterly adorable. She squeezed it tight the moment she had hold of it. "Well, how about that then?" said her father as he led her away, then gave a chuckle. "I don't suppose you'd be able to tell me which sheep will win the big race tomorrow." Britta smiled knowingly, her smile sticky and satisfied. The next day, Britta ran to the base of the hill with her new bird and Colin the collie in tow. Usually the last hill climb was the most arduous part, but today she barely noticed the strain on her young knees. Susan was there, as she had been the previous day, once again sipping on a cup of tea. Her foot was tapping and her head was bobbing. "Susan!" Britta shrieked, drawing the woman away from her reverie. "Good afternoon, Britta," she replied. "And what is it that you have there?" "I won it," Britta answered breathlessly. "I won it at a stall, and there was a man and he had lots of cups, and one of them had a white flower with a blue stalk, and I picked it and the acorn was underneath it. And then I won Barry." "Barry?" Britta giggled and jiggled the bird up and down. Susan pursed her cracked lips. "Fancy that?" "I believe now," said Britta. "I believe you now. You can read the clouds." "Indeed," said Susan. Then, to Britta's surprise, Susan turned her back slightly, so that she was facing away from her. Britta placed a hand on Colin, who was panting heavily, and waited for the woman to say something. but she said nothing. Britta's knees began to bob up and down as she waited, but the strange woman simply hummed to herself, a strange tune that she had never heard before. When she could stand waiting no longer, she took a deep breath. "Could you do it again?" Susan stopped humming and slowly turned her gaze towards Britta. "Pardon me? Could you do another bit of magic?" Britta asked. "You know." She pointed up at the sky, which today had barely a cloud upon its blue surface. But Britta believed now, believed with all her heart. Susan clasped her hands together. "Were you not aware that it is rude to ask?" Britta's breath caught. Yes, she had been taught this. She meekly took a step backwards and dipped her head slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I just want to see you do it again. It was so wonderful. Maybe the bestest thing I've ever seen. Please." She chanced a glance up at Susan, who was staring at her intently. Then the woman smiled, and her face suddenly didn't look so ghastly. "Very well," she replied. "I shall perform one more reading for you. Just one, mind." Britta nodded eagerly, her head lifting to the sky, the very blue, very clear sky, that contained barely a wisp of fluffy whiteness. She was secure in this knowledge. So instead, she looked to Susan, watched her like a hawk. The woman closed her eyes for several moments before opening them again, her head drifting lazily from side to side. Her entire body was deathly still as she worked her spell upon the sky. Britta then realised that she had been holding her breath and exhaled as gently as she could. Even Colin sat as if he were once again transfixed. And then, as she had done the previous day, she gave a bark of triumph. "A bear!" "A bear?" "A bear," cried the woman, "with painted blue and slick of fur. He holds a stick between his paws with a fish attached to the end." Britta began to giggle, but the woman snapped her gaze down towards the girl with unfathomable speed, and she shut up immediately. "Ill tidings does this creature bring," said Susan melodically, "and take heed. He will strike at 7. Britta suddenly felt a chill in the air. The weather was still glorious, but there was definitely an edge, and suddenly she did not feel quite at ease. There was no smile to Susan. All sense of joviality was gone. Then she gestured with her head down the hill. "Go now, child," she whispered, "and remember, 7. There was nothing else for it. Susan's stare was absolute. Britta found herself nodding, even as her feet took her backwards. Then she turned and ran, perhaps even faster than she had arrived. It was evening. Britta was once again down by the water's edge. The man from yesterday from whom she had won Barry was gone, but more were in his place. It was a busy, bustling scene. She was nervous, aware of some enormous responsibility, but not quite finding a way to grasp it. Her eyes kept lifting to the great timepiece that was the first thing people came to when they wandered down from the village to the water. The sand within was drifting slowly downwards, filling up the lower part of the piece. In a few moments, the sand would reach a line, and beside that line, the number 7 had been painted black. This had to be what Susan had seen. A bear was going to come at 7. He was probably going to lumber in from the forest, maybe trying to gobble someone who was eating one of the grilled fish steaks that were being cooked tonight. That was surely it. She watched and watched until the sand hit the line. It was 7 at night. The sun was beginning to set and the children were beginning to be taken home. Her mother would come for her soon, but Britta still had work to do. The sand kept falling. The line of sand rose higher and higher, going far beyond the 7th line. And still, no bear. She was beginning to worry. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Susan had been wrong and had just got lucky the previous night. She stood, for her legs were beginning to ache, stretched them even as she began to cast her gaze about from the forest to the pier. The crowds were definitely thinner now. She was able to make out individuals and groups of individuals. Some of the stall holders were beginning to back up. Some of the youngest children were being carried home with their heads resting against an adult's shoulder. At the very tip of the pier, a large group were still gathered. It appeared to be some kind of party. They were certainly making enough noise, and that was just the adults. There were a group of about 6 children, most of whom she recognised. One was a boy named Aidan. She also recognised Aidan's mother, the baker, and Aidan's father, a hunter, and Aidan's teenage sister, and Aidan's uncle, who had a small shop in the village. In fact, all of Aidan's family were there. Britta began to walk. There was so much happiness. Aidan had a thick smile plastered on his face as the adults all around him began to collect the plates and goblets. The space was cleared. Britta began to jog. A strange glow appeared. Some of the children began to squeal with delight, though Aidan, to his credit, remained reasonably calm as the cake was brought out. Britta began to run. His father said something. His mother was standing to one side, hands clasped up to her mouth. The cake had been placed before the boy, and the shimmering light from the candles reflected and danced in his eyes. 7 candles. "Get away!" Britta screamed. "Get away from the edge!" She flew, as fast as her little legs would carry her. People all around were staring at this strange little girl ranting and raving. People from the party were beginning to notice her. "Get away from the edge!" she cried. "Get away! Get away! Aidan!" Her father looked up, brow furrowed. All of the children were now gaping at her. Several of the adults looked appalled. "Get away! Get away! The water! The water!" It was enough. It had to be enough, but she was not going to make it in time. She felt her eyes streaming as her feet thundered against the wooden planks. Aidan's father, Aidan's wonderful father, finally turned towards the water. That was when there was a tremendous splash, and a mass of black surged from the water. The hunter instincts kicked in, and the man somehow managed to get his hands underneath his son's arms and lift him clean into the air, clean from the spot where the water bear landed. It began to scramble, gurgling a cry at the adults that were now beginning to surround it. Water bears were tough little blighters, but this one was only young and was soon being hounded back into the water. It had missed its catch. It was a more overcast sky the next day, and the clouds were thick and heavy with rain. Britta did not run up the hill this time. She approached Susan with a mixture of fear and awe. She had left Colin behind, and Barry as well, in case the rain arrived. There was nothing worse than a sopping, wet, miserable dog. "Good afternoon, child," said Susan, once again sipping her tea. "Good afternoon, Susan," said Britta. She didn't stay standing. Instead, she moved towards Susan. The woman watched the girl carefully as Britta placed herself directly in front of her and came to rest on her knees. Susan lowered the cup. "I want to learn." Susan said nothing. She merely peered down her crooked nose at the small girl before her. Britta straightened her back. "What you told me yesterday saved Aidan's life," she said slowly. "You're a hero, Susan. But I know that you can't always be around. So I want to learn to read the clouds so that I can protect my village." Susan continued to stare, and Britta was once again half tempted to flee, but she remained firm and defiant, staring back at the woman with stubborn determination. "Please, Susan," she said, "tell me how to read the clouds." Susan's gaze bore into Britta for several long moments. Finally, she closed her eyes. "A test." Britta shifted her head to one side, waiting patiently for Susan to elaborate. "I will provide you with a test," said Susan. "If you pass the test, then I will teach you to read the clouds." Britta's heart gave an unsteady leap. There was a chance. "What do I have to do?" Susan paused once again before glancing up to the sky and back again.
"There is a vision currently in the sky, and it is a clear one," said the woman. "I will provide you with the basic tools that you will require to spot it. If you manage to successfully spot it, I will give you the rest of the information you need to pass the test. If you can return to me by this time tomorrow, I will teach you the ways of the sky."
Britta's eyes were wide, her body bouncing up and down on her knees. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I can do it."
"We shall see,"
said Susan, and finally there was a flicker of a smile. Then she too straightened her back.
"Close your eyes, child, and direct your body to the sky. Make sure you are comfortable."
Britta obeyed, and flipped onto her back so that she was lying with the sky directly before her. She didn't want to miss a thing. Then she closed her eyes.
"I am going to imbue you with the technique," said Susan. "Do not panic. It is perfectly natural. It is how I see the world. If you can find the vision, I will do as I have said."
Britta tried to relax, but the tension was too much. She was going to do it. She was really going to be a magic person. A freelance spell weaver. She heard Susan exhale, and suddenly there was a rush of sound around her. Instinctually, her eyes blazed open. She could not help but cry out. The sky was awash with every colour imaginable. Reds and greens, blues and oranges, and purples and yellows, all swirling and mixing and dashing and dancing. Some took the form of wisps, others took the form of slow-moving blocks. These were clouds. Real clouds. She felt herself become lost in the beauty of it all, as yellow dashes zipped across the sky and crashed into a block of blue, creating a mesmerising fizzle of green. There was no sound, other than the rushing all around her, as if it were an airless breeze. Somewhere up there was a picture. But how would it manifest itself? A red streak seemed to lift from the very horizon, soaring into the sky and scattering a purple cloud into a series of smaller ones. A blue one seemed to change into a pink one before her very eyes. Her head began to spin. And then she spotted something that didn't belong. Interspersed amongst the colours, there were a series of white clouds drifting. They were hard to spot. If she did not concentrate, then they would disappear from view. She allowed her gaze to wander idly, and soon found that she could catch the white out of the corner of her eyes. As long as she didn't look at them directly, she could see the pattern that they were forming. Every now and again, she had to ease her gaze away as the white came into view. There was something. It was so close. Clear, Susan had said. Obvious. Straight edges. A line of white pierced straight through a sky blue cloud and met with another straight line at an angle. And there were 4 of them. Hold it. Hold it just a little longer. The 4 lines touched. They were connected into something so familiar and so basic that Britta couldn't help but cry out. A square! A square? A square! She repeated, as she felt the world around her return. The rushing sound vanished in an instant. She immediately recoiled at the sweat that had covered her body and looked up towards Susan, eyes wild. I saw a square, she said breathlessly, big and white and clear amongst the clouds. It had to have been that. It was. Britta gave another shriek, utterly unable to sit still. She wanted to hug the woman. You saw a box. A box. A box, said the woman. A box that contains what you need. I will tell you where to find this box. When you find it, everything will become clear. Britta was nodding feverishly. Is it far? Not at all, said Susan softly. You will find the box in Gander's Cove. Britta frowned. Gander's Cove was literally a tiny cave that children liked to play in, not far from where she currently was. And she only had to return to Susan by this time tomorrow. She could return from the cove and back in less than an hour. I know where it is, said Britta, leaping to her feet. I'll go right now."
"Very well," said Susan, lifting her cup once again. "I shall be waiting right here."
Britta did not wait for anything else. She had everything she needed. She took off down the hill without a backwards glance as the first spits of rain began to fall. Gander's Cove was just as she remembered it. Completely unremarkable. The only difference was that it felt a lot smaller than it had before. She had to crouch to squeeze her way through. Immediately, she regretted not bringing something to light her way. Maybe that was why Susan had given her so long. This was an adventure. Her parents had read her many great adventure stories when she'd been little. Those wise old explorers never left home without a glow rod. Once she squeezed through the opening passage, she found herself in a larger cavern. From somewhere, light was filtering in, casting the cavern in a ghostly hue. Gander's Cove had never been this big. Maybe someone had excavated it for gold or diamond or coal. She feared that it would take her longer than she thought to find this box. But no. It was there, up on a ridge, an unnatural feature that starkly stood out like a freeze fox in summer. Her heart began to hammer. She started to climb. The box looked securely perched on its ledge, and Britta was not that heavy. The potentially unstable rubble and rocks held her weight securely, and in no time at all she was level with the box. It was far bigger than it had looked from down on the ground. So much so that she could not see to the back of it. From her initial glance, it appeared that the box contained nothing. It had to be at the back. She eased herself forward, placing her hands on the top edge of the box and leaned in. To her astonishment, she still could not see a thing. It simply couldn't be this big. She placed one foot inside the box. There was nothing inside. Not unless it had rolled to the very, very back of the box. That was the only thing for it. Maybe someone had found it before her. The secret to clouds. Maybe it belonged to someone else. Another child from the village who would become the hero. She shook her head. This was hers, and hers alone. She stepped into the box, before dropping to her hands and knees and began to crawl forward. All the way until she reached the back of the box. She felt it with her hands, steel and cold. There was nothing there, and the uppermost edge of the box had not been steel. Snap. There was a bang behind her, a grinding of metal mixed in with her own scream, and the light immediately vanished. On a solitary hill on the outskirts of a village called Braith, a woman sat with her eyes up to the sky. She was watching the colours. They danced, and they twirled, and they swirled. They were alive. Once, 100 years ago, they had astounded her. She watched the white square closely, all whilst sipping her tea. The white square was fully formed, static in a sky full of movement, and nothing within. Then the colours began to move. It was almost as though they slowed, yielding to something. The woman watched as the colours that had been dancing in the middle of the square seemed to move to one side, as several more streaks of white cloud entered into the square. They began to cross in a most orderly fashion, overlap and adjust, until they formed a pattern of crossing white lines, each as straight and as solid as the ones that encompassed them. She was a most patient woman. It was a rare gift of hers. Then she heard a sound, and the vision immediately vanished and was replaced by the rain and rumble of thunder. The sound that she had heard was a voice. She shifted her head to one side. A boy was wandering, calling out a name. He was looking a little lost. The woman licked her lips and cleared her throat. "Let's do the time warp again." So there we go, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. Obviously it's not going to be you know, a completely polished thing, because I literally write these stories in one sitting, because I've given myself a very tight time schedule to stick to with these stories, which is fine because it keeps me disciplined. So that's the way I want to do it. If you have a prompt for next week's story, again, this is going to obviously become kind of the regular thing for this project. If you have a prompt, as before, leave it in the comments down below, and by sort of late Saturday, Sunday, I will have chosen one, and I try and write the stories on Mondays and go from there. So yeah, if you've got some prompt that you'd like to leave it in the comments down below. If you like this video, please do not forget to give it a thumbs up, because that will tell me how well it has done, and obviously this is a new project, so that's very important at this stage. If you're new to the channel and you've only just discovered me today, check out some of my other videos where you can see my face, and if they entertain you as well, subscribe to the channel and you'll be notified when more booktube, authortube, writing videos and skit type content come your way. So that is all I have time for you today. So with that being said, my name is Mark, this is Toast Dragon Fantasy, and I will hopefully see you with my own eyes in the next video. Goodbye.